The katana blade gleamed under the dojo lights, 3 feet of folded steel that had been in Miyamoto Kiko's family for 6 generations. She held it in perfect chudan no kamae, the traditional middle guard position, with the sharp edge angled directly toward Bruce Lee's throat. Bruce stood 10 feet away, shirtless and unarmed. His hands were open and relaxed in a Wing Chun ready position. Behind them, 30 karate students sat in stunned silence, watching what should have been impossible. A martial artist accepting a challenge from a swordmaster with no weapon of his own. This is the story of the most controversial martial arts demonstration in Tokyo history, and why the Japanese Sword Federation tried to have all footage of the event destroyed. Shinjuku Dojo, Tokyo, Japan, March 8, 1971. The dojo belonged to Master Teiji Yamamoto, a 7th Dan karate instructor who had studied under Gichin Funakoshi himself. He ran one of the most respected traditional training facilities in Tokyo. No tournaments, no trophies. Only serious students seeking genuine martial arts knowledge. Master Yamamoto had invited Bruce Lee to give a demonstration of Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do to his advanced students. He was curious about these Chinese and hybrid systems that were starting to gain attention in martial arts circles. Miyamoto Kiko was not one of Yamamoto's regular students. She was a 28-year-old kendo and aikido master who held 5th Dan rankings in both arts. Coming from a samurai family that had served the Tokugawa shogunate before the Meiji Restoration, her great-great-grandfather had been a renowned swordsman. The family katana she carried had seen real combat during the Boshin War of 1868. Kiko had dedicated her life to preserving traditional Japanese sword arts. She trained 6 hours a day since she was 7. She viewed the recent influx of foreign martial arts into Japan with deep skepticism, bordering on hostility. She had come to Yamamoto's dojo specifically because she heard Bruce Lee would be there. She intended to make a point about the superiority of classical Japanese martial arts over what she saw as trendy modern systems. During Bruce's demonstration of wooden dummy techniques and pad work, Kiko had stood in the back of the dojo with her arms crossed, her expression making her disapproval obvious. When Bruce finished and opened the floor for questions, Kiko stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Mr. Lee," she said, her Japanese formal and precise. "I have watched your demonstration with interest. I must say, I am not impressed by these techniques against cooperative partners and inanimate training equipment. Traditional martial arts were developed for real combat against armed opponents, not for performance." She paused, then continued with the confidence of someone who had never lost a match in her discipline. "I am a practitioner of classical Japanese sword arts. I believe your methods would fail completely against someone trained in traditional weapons." Bruce listened respectfully, then responded in his limited but functional Japanese, with Master Yamamoto translating when needed. "I appreciate your perspective," he said. "You're correct that many modern martial arts have lost connection with practical application. However, effective technique should work, regardless of whether the opponent is armed or unarmed. The principles remain the same: timing, distance management, and understanding of body mechanics and human limitations." Kiko's expression hardened. "Principles are abstractions. Reality is steel. If you truly believe your methods are effective, would you demonstrate them against a real blade?" She gestured toward the katana resting in its stand near the dojo entrance. "That is my family sword, sharpened for tameshigiri practice. If you can defeat me while I wield it, I will acknowledge that your techniques have merit. If you cannot, you should stop teaching students methods that would get them killed in a real confrontation." The dojo went completely silent. Every student understood what Kiko was proposing: a challenge match between an unarmed martial artist and a sword master using a live blade. Master Yamamoto stood immediately, preparing to refuse on Bruce's behalf and eject Kiko from the dojo for such a dangerous suggestion. But Bruce raised his hand politely. "I accept your challenge," he said, "but under specific conditions. First, your blade must be real and sharp as you described. No training sword. Second, you must attempt to strike me with genuine intent, as you would a real opponent. Third, We establish a time limit of 3 minutes. If I cannot disarm you or force you to yield within that time, I acknowledge your point about traditional arts. If I succeed, you acknowledge that effective technique transcends style and weapons. Kiko nodded once, sharply. Agreed. The dojo went completely silent. Every student understood what Kiko was proposing, a real challenge match between an unarmed martial artist and a sword master using a live blade. Master Yamamoto stood up immediately, ready to refuse on Bruce's behalf and ask Kiko to leave the dojo for making such a dangerous suggestion. But Bruce raised his hand politely, signaling he wanted to respond. I accept your challenge, Bruce said, but under specific conditions. First, your blade must be real and sharp, as you described, no training sword. Second, you must attempt to strike me with genuine intent, as you would a real opponent. Third, we set a time limit of 3 minutes. If I cannot disarm you or force you to yield within that time, I acknowledge your point about traditional arts. If I succeed, you acknowledge that effective technique transcends style and weapons. Kiko nodded once sharply. Agreed. Master Yamamoto pulled Bruce aside and spoke to him urgently in a mix of Japanese and English. Lee-san, this is extremely dangerous. Miyamoto-san is a legitimate sword expert. That blade can remove a limb with minimal effort. Even a shallow cut could sever tendons or arteries. Please reconsider. Bruce placed a reassuring hand on the older master's shoulder and smiled. I understand the danger, Yamamoto-sensei, and I respect your concern. But this is exactly the kind of challenge that tests whether martial arts are practical or merely theoretical. I've trained specifically for weapon defense scenarios. This is an opportunity to demonstrate those principles. The students quickly rearranged themselves, sitting along the walls to clear as much space as possible in the center of the dojo. Kiko performed a brief ritual bow to her sword, then took her position at one end of the training area. Bruce walked to the opposite end, removed his shoes according to dojo etiquette, and stood barefoot on the polished wooden floor. He rolled his shoulders once, took 3 deep breaths to center himself, and settled into a loose, ready stance. Weight evenly distributed, hands open and relaxed at chest level. Master Yamamoto positioned himself as referee, though he clearly hoped to stop the match before anyone got seriously hurt. He looked at both participants, received a nod from each, and gave the traditional command. Hajime, begin. Kiko advanced immediately, closing the distance with smooth, practiced steps. Her blade was held in Seigan no Kamae, the point aimed directly at Bruce's eyes, a classic position that threatens vision while maintaining strong defensive capability. Bruce moved laterally, circling at the edge of what traditional kenjutsu practitioners call the critical distance, the range where an attack becomes possible. He was studying her movement patterns, the subtle weight shifts that preceded strikes, and the way her hands gripped the tsuka. Kiko struck without warning. A men cut aimed at the top of Bruce's head, executed with textbook form and surprising speed. The blade descended in a perfect arc, the kind of cut that would split a rolled tatami mat cleanly in 2. Bruce moved his head exactly 4 inches to the left, while simultaneously stepping in toward Kiko rather than away, violating the instinctive response to retreat from a blade. The katana passed through empty air where his head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Bruce's forward movement placed him inside the sword's effective range, where its length suddenly became a disadvantage instead of an advantage. His right hand shot out in a wing chun pak sao, a slapping deflection that struck Kiko's forward wrist just as the sword completed its downward arc. This pushed the blade further offline and disrupted her ability to recover for a second cut. At the same time, his left hand grabbed her right elbow, controlling the joint and preventing her from rotating the blade back toward him. The entire sequence took perhaps 2 seconds, but Bruce had already established a position where the sword was temporarily neutralized. Kiko's training kicked in immediately. She executed a tai sabaki, a body rotation designed to break free from grabs and re-establish optimal distance. She succeeded in pulling away from Bruce's initial control, but the brief contact had given Bruce crucial information about her strength, balance, and reaction speed. They separated to neutral distance. Kiko adjusted her assessment of her opponent. He had moved with a precision she hadn't expected, and his timing had been impeccable. She attacked again, this time with a tsuki, a thrust aimed at Bruce's solar plexus, a faster and more difficult technique to defend against than the overhead cut. Bruce demonstrated why decades of Chisao training creates reflexes that operate faster than conscious thought. His hands moved in a tan sao and bong sao combination, deflecting the thrust just enough to pass by his torso while simultaneously closing the distance again. But Kiko had anticipated this. She executed a horizontal kesa cut, slashing diagonally across Bruce's path with enough force to sever ribs. What happened next became the subject of analysis and debate for years afterward. Bruce dropped his weight suddenly, lowering his entire body 6 inches through pure leg compression. The blade passed over his shoulder by a hair's breadth. Students in the front row later swore they could see individual hairs on Bruce's head move in the wake of the passing steel. As Kiko's momentum carried the sword past its target, Bruce's right leg swept her front foot, a Wing Chun sok choi sweep that disrupted her base at the exact moment when her weight was most committed to the cut. Kiko stumbled but maintained her grip on the katana. She spun on her back foot to face Bruce again. She was breathing harder now, frustrated that she had delivered 2 potentially lethal cuts that should have connected but somehow missed. Bruce remained calm and centered, showing no sign of stress or fatigue. They had been engaged for approximately 90 seconds. The next exchange happened so quickly that even the experienced martial artists watching had difficulty processing the details. Kiko feinted a high cut, then dropped into a surriage, a sliding deflection attack aimed at Bruce's extended arm, intending to cut the tendons and disable his ability to defend. Bruce recognized the feint and didn't commit to defending the high attack. When the real cut came at his arm, he executed a Bill Sao, a thrusting finger strike that intercepted Kiko's hands rather than the blade itself. He struck the pressure points on the back of her hands with enough force to momentarily disrupt her grip strength. The katana wavered in her hands for just a fraction of a second. That was enough. Bruce's other hand wrapped around her right wrist. His body rotated, using his hips as a fulcrum. Suddenly, Kiko found herself being pulled forward and down by her own committed force. She had 2 choices: release the sword or fall forward onto her face. Her samurai pride wouldn't allow her to release her family blade voluntarily, so she fell. Bruce guided that fall precisely, controlling her descent so she landed safely but firmly on the dojo floor, face down, with Bruce behind her, maintaining control of her right wrist and the sword hand. He applied what Wing Chun practitioners call a chin lock, a joint manipulation that made it mechanically impossible for Kiko to maintain her grip or move the blade. The pain receptors in her wrist fired immediately. Her hand opened reflexively, and the katana clattered to the wooden floor. Bruce immediately released the lock, stepped back, and bowed respectfully. The entire match had lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds, 15 seconds under the agreed time limit. Master Yamamoto stood frozen, his hand halfway raised to signal the end of the match, trying to process what he had just witnessed. The students erupted in confused chatter, some shocked, some excited, all trying to understand how an unarmed fighter had disarmed a legitimate swordmaster without getting cut once. Kiko remained on the floor for a long moment, staring at her empty hand and the katana lying just 2 feet away. Bruce walked over to where the sword lay, picked it up carefully with both hands as one should handle a katana, and carried it back to Kiko, who had risen to a sitting position. He presented it to her formally, blade facing himself as a sign of respect and non-aggression. "Miyamoto-san, you are an exceptional swordswoman," he said. "Your technique is precise, your cuts were genuine, and you honored our agreement to fight with full intent. I did not defeat your art. I simply applied principles that work against any attack, armed or unarmed. Timing, positioning, and understanding of mechanical advantage. Your traditional training is valuable and should be preserved, but all martial arts, traditional or modern, must be tested against resistance to remain effective." Kiko took her sword, returned it to its sire, and performed a formal rei, a deep bow from a seated position. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "I have trained with this sword for 21 years, she said. "I have defeated over 200 opponents in kendo matches. I have never been disarmed. You did not use tricks or luck. You understood the weaknesses in sword combat, that most unarmed fighters never comprehend, that the weapon is only effective at certain distances and angles, and that controlling the hand that holds the weapon is more important than avoiding the weapon itself. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I was wrong to challenge you with arrogance, and I was wrong to assume traditional methods are superior simply because they are old. The dojo remained silent. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air. A woman from one of Japan's oldest sword lineages had publicly acknowledged that an unarmed Chinese martial artist had bested her with a live blade, in her own country, in front of 30 witnesses. Bruce bowed deeply in return. Thank you for the honor of this challenge, he said. Your skill is genuine and your spirit is strong. Traditional arts like yours carry centuries of wisdom. They should never be dismissed, but all martial arts must evolve and be tested, or they become decorations instead of tools for survival. Master Yamamoto finally stepped forward, visibly relieved that no one had been seriously injured. He bowed to both fighters. This has been a most educational demonstration, he said, his voice still carrying some shock. Let us end with mutual respect. The students began to clap, first hesitantly, then with growing enthusiasm. What had started as a potential disaster had become something far more valuable, a genuine exchange of knowledge between two dedicated martial artists from different worlds. After the formal bows and closing of the session, Kiko approached Bruce privately, while the students were still talking excitedly among themselves. I would like to learn more about your methods, she said, not to replace my own training, but to understand how they complement it. Would you be open to sharing some principles before you return to Hong Kong? Bruce smiled warmly. Of course, martial arts should build bridges, not walls. Over the next few hours in a smaller training room, Bruce showed Kiko some basic Wing Chun concepts, centerline theory, economy of motion, and the idea of intercepting attacks rather than meeting them with force. Kiko, in turn, demonstrated some fundamental kenjutsu footwork and cutting principles. The exchange was respectful, curious, and filled with the kind of mutual learning that rarely happens between practitioners of such different traditions. March 8th, 1971, Shinjuku Dojo, 30 witnesses. 2 minutes and 45 seconds that changed Kiko Miyamoto's understanding of combat and led her to spend the next 3 years studying Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do alongside her traditional sword arts. She went on to become one of Japan's leading advocates for cross-training between different martial systems, writing extensively about how traditional arts must adapt and test themselves against other methodologies to remain truly effective. Bruce returned to Hong Kong the next day and rarely discussed the match publicly, considering it a private demonstration rather than a public spectacle. The Japanese Sword Federation requested that Master Yamamoto not distribute any photographs or details of the event, concerned it would encourage dangerous weapon challenges. But several students kept personal notes that eventually became the basis for this story. The story of that March evening in 1971 didn't stay inside the Shinjuku Dojo. It quietly spread through martial arts circles in Tokyo and beyond. Students who had been there told their training partners told their own students. Within months, the tale of the unarmed Chinese martial artist who had disarmed a respected Japanese swordmaster with a live blade had travelled from dojo to dojo. Kiko Miyamoto never stopped practicing her traditional sword arts. But that demonstration changed how she trained. She began asking deeper questions. She started exploring ideas beyond her own lineage. The woman who had once believed classical Japanese methods were inherently superior now understood that every art has its strengths and its blind spots. She spent the next 3 years studying Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do alongside her Kendo and Iaido training. She went on to become one of Japan's leading advocates for cross-training between different martial systems. She wrote articles and gave lectures about how traditional arts must adapt and test themselves against other methodologies to remain truly effective in the modern world. Bruce Lee returned to Hong Kong the next day. He rarely spoke publicly about the match, viewing it as a private demonstration rather than a public victory. For him, it had simply been another opportunity to test his principles under real pressure. Master Yamamoto kept the event low profile at the request of the Japanese Sword Federation, who were concerned it might encourage dangerous challenges with live blades. But several students kept personal notes and sketches. Those records eventually became the foundation for this story. What happened in that Shinjuku dojo on March 8, 1971, was never really about who won or lost. It was about two dedicated martial artists from very different traditions choosing respect over ego, learning over pride, and understanding over superiority. It showed that real strength isn't measured by the weapon in your hand or the length of your family lineage. It's measured by your willingness to test what you believe, your humility when you discover its limits, and your openness to growth when someone shows you something new. Kiko Miyamoto carried that lesson with her for the rest of her life. She continued teaching traditional sword arts while also incorporating practical concepts from other systems. Her students learned not just how to cut with a katana, but how to think critically about combat, distance, timing, and efficiency. Bruce Lee continued refining his own path, always emphasizing that martial arts should be alive, practical, and free from rigid tradition. He believed the highest form of respect was honest testing, not blind acceptance or arrogant dismissal. The 30 students who witnessed that demonstration never forgot it. Many of them went on to become instructors themselves, carrying the memory of that night into their own teaching. They taught their students that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the biggest weapon or the loudest reputation. It's the one you underestimate, and sometimes the most valuable lessons come not from victory, but from the quiet moment when two warriors from different worlds choose understanding over conquest. That is the true legacy of March 8, 1971. Not a story of defeat or triumph, but a reminder that the best martial artists are the ones who never stop learning.